You are a servant no longer. You will teach me Urdu and the Quran.
You've upset the order of everything.
Drop this Indian peasant, or we will have you certified insane.
Treason! I am cantankerous, greedy, fat. I am perhaps disagreeably attached to power, but I am anything but insane. I am Queen of England, Empress of India. Abdul's risen on his own merits. Now he is my friend. I haven't been as happy as this for years.
Albert Edward, the new King Edward VII, and he was outspokenly outraged by the casual racism of the empire. Because a man has a black face and a different religion than our own, there is no reason why he should be treated as a brute.
What General Weygand has called the Battle of France is over. The Battle of Britain is about to begin. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. Upon it depends our own British life and the long continuity of our institutions and our empire. The whole fury and might of the enemy must very soon be turned on us. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be freed, and the life of the world may move forward into broad, sunlit uplands. But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age, made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty, and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its commonwealths last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour. The gratitude of every home in our island, in our empire, and indeed throughout the world, except in the abodes of the guilty, goes out to the British airmen who, undaunted by odds, unwearied in their constant challenge and mortal danger, are turning the tide of the world war by their prowess and by their devotion. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few.
I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and to the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong. But I shall not have strength to carry out this resolution alone unless you join in it with me, as I now invite you to do. I know that your support will be unfailingly given. God help me to make good my vow, and God bless all of you who are willing to share in it.
Hey everyone, it's Carter. I have a speech I want to give about history, specifically British history. If you didn't know, I'm actually a third British. My grandmother's parents and grandparents, my mom's mother, are from Northern Ireland, from Londonderry and County Antrim. Meanwhile, my grandfather's, she also has her grandmother is from Scotland, one of hers. And I also have English ancestry from my grandfather, from my English great-grandmother Lillian Haynes. I actually plan on moving to the United Kingdom next year, and I have my unique take on history that's different from a lot of other people's. I actually I support British imperialism as a historical concept, meaning I think the British Empire was a force for significant good. I don't think everything that my people, my ancestors did was good, but I think the vast majority of it was good and backed up by moral beliefs. Now, why do I think that? I think that for several reasons. First off, the British did more than any other power to spread the ideas of free markets, limited government, and unalienable human rights around the world. It ended the slave trade in the New World first off by being the first major European power to end slavery, and then devote half the Royal Navy's budget to ending the slave trade every year and compensating slave owners from the empire so much that Britain only stopped paying off the debts that it obtained by doing this in the 2000s. Yes, only a decade ago it stopped paying off debts from the 1830s for the 1870s. That's how much they spent on doing it. They did more than any other power by a lot to end the slavery. And even in the country I was born in, the United States, the existence of slavery in that country was threatened by the British ending the slave trade. We would not have had a civil war if it weren't for the British Empire. Furthermore, the British justified their expansion to Africa, which has often been seen in many textbooks, especially in African American studies classes at universities, as controversial. They justified the expansion to Africa by ending the slave trade. When the first white person to cross the entire continent of Africa saw what was going on, how whole entire communities in Africa were being shipped off by Portuguese and Arab slavers, he was appalled, and it became part of Britain's mission to spread the empire in order to bring not just Christianity and Judeo-Christo-Islamic values, Abrahamic values to Africa, but also to end slavery for good in the continents. A famous British newspaper that still exists today, The Telegraph, ran an article in 1905 when the British took some colony in Africa. The specifics I do not know, but I do know that this is true. They said that the reason why they did this was they wanted to forever end slavery in East Africa and bring the light of Western civilization to the dark continents. Why? And also the dark continent was dark because Africa was the most undeveloped place in the world at the time, and it still is. Many people in Africa at this time lived in small rural villages completely isolated from the outside world, except maybe beyond like a few dozen miles from where they lived. The British also ended the practice of female genital mutilation in Africa, which was a form of torture that is condemned by the UN today. The British also ended the practice of killing twins in places like Nigeria. In many cultures in Nigeria, twins were considered evil and they were left to die in the woods. The British ended this because to the British, leaving children to die was not acceptable. The British also did facilitate trade in Africa by building railroads and spread capitalist ideas of free markets to Africa. There are several success stories of this. South Africa today is one of the richest countries in Africa and is a moderately rich nation on the global scale with a per capita income of $12,000 per person a year, which does not seem that much to an American or a European, but still is above subsistence and allows people to buy basic goods, not just substance basic goods, but I mean things like televisions, stuff like that. South Africa is a relatively rich country. And while a lot of the funds did go to Britain, the British justified this by the fact that what helps people in Britain helps the empire, because if the people in Britain are getting their fair share, then they can reinvest funds into places like Africa and India and make people around the empire better. The British brought good, solid, honest administration. Corruption was almost negligent in the British Empire, which was something not before seen on the continents. And while it is true that Africans often did not reach the highest positions within the empire of which they served, this can be justified as the British perspective. If we give Africans the highest positions, then we're not really in control, are we? We cannot enforce our values if someone from another cultural values is leading the country. No, first we must convert them to Abrahamic values, which I think we all here in Europe. Thanks, Siri. Sorry, I accidentally did Siri, and yeah, my Siri is in German. I'm trying to learn it. That would be my third language, I know. Anyways, they we're trying to bring values such as that we have in the West to Africa. You might say, oh, but the Africans have their own values. But keep in mind, I just said the African values were of that of a society that was honestly pre-Mesopotamia. The African peoples, there were some advanced civilizations in Africa, like Ethiopia, which actually remained independent during this time. And there were some, and like there was this famous city in Central Africa. I forget what it was called. It was one of the, but it was during the golden age of Africa when Europe was separated from the Black Lake. That was a good time. But these were actually isolated parts of Africa even at that time. And by the time Europeans arrived, Africa was at its darkest point. The values of much of Africa had always been one of a tribal society, not even a feudal society. So by bringing Western values was actually helping people, because the British had great thinkers and scientists. Bringing their ideas to Africa really helped these people. Imagine seeing a car, a railroad track for the first time. Imagine being educated in school, learning the alphabet and how to write and how to read for the first time. That is what the British brought to Africa. Yes, the British did at times commit atrocities in Africa, another point I want to make. But the British were in Africa and various parts of Africa for centuries. They were in South Africa for at least 150 years, and you could arguably argue that they're still there now, since there's still British settlers there. The British were in West Africa for even longer than that. And yes, while the British were only in the vast majority of colonies in Africa for just 70 years, the atrocities committed in that time, that specific time, add up to limited parts of Africa for a combined total of just in limited parts. These only happened a few years of the 70, probably a decade or less. And if you want to include all the crimes that happened in the entirety of British history in Africa, maybe you get like 24 years where there were serious crimes being committed. And I think that we need to recognize that. We need to recognize we committed crimes, we need to apologize for them, and we need to make it right. We should be given reparations to the ethnic groups that we committed crimes against. And we should apologize to them, and we should have a day of remembrance for that. But at the same time, we need to recognize that the overall objectives of the empire and what it accomplished were good, and that this was a very small fraction of the time we spent in Africa, and that overall, what we did is good. You might also point to South Africa and apartheid, but I want to point out that it was the Dutch who practiced apartheid in South Africa. The British did not want apartheid. They actually wanted to give black people the right to vote. The Dutch were against this, and when they started doing apartheid, the British government objected, and then they declared full independence. It was the Dutch who did it, and they managed to get some of the British, and not all of them, on board, because what was happening in the rest of Africa is that the native Africans were turning on the white people because of black nationalism, because black people had been exposed to nationalism from time serving in Europe in both world wars, and actually crimes were being committed against white people now. They did not want to see that happen to them, so some of them supported apartheid, not all of them. Furthermore, there was many people in the British government who denounced racism at every level. For example, King Edward V literally actually said this exact quote: "Just because a person has a black face and a different religion than our own does not make him a savage or a brute." He was firmly against racism, and he was also a proponent of working class rights, but that's a subject for another day. And his mother, Queen Victoria, two of her closest advisors were Indian. They weren't Anglo-Indians, they weren't British settlers in India, they were native people of India. One was a Hindu and one was a Muslim. And when people actually tried to get her declared unfit to be queen for mental illness because she did that. But she insisted on keeping them because she claimed that her detractors were simply practicing racism. She actually learned Hindi, and Arabic to read the Quran because she considered the Indian people to be her people too. She was Empress of India, so in her eyes, they were her subjects just as people were in England. And yes, like I said, the crimes committed in Africa were the exception, not the rule. To say the British in Africa were inherently bad because of the crimes committed is like saying the Habsburg Empire was inherently bad because of what they did in Serbia in World War I, because of the Hungarian Revolution, how that was put down, and by the 40 Years' War. No one says that. You're saying the exact same thing. Or you could say that the state of Germany is evil because of World War II and because of the rape of Belgium. Or you're saying France is evil because of the anti-Semitism in France. To say the British Empire was evil in Africa because of a few isolated incidents is saying the same thing that I just mentioned. Now I want to go over to Ireland. And once again, I wanted to apologize. Actually, for the first, I want to apologize. This is going to take a long video. But the history of the British Empire spans 800 years, and I'm trying to summarize it as best I can, while still making my points that I know people will make in the comments of this video. Also, if I haven't already, I apologize for the crudiness of this video. I'm on my computer because I figured it would be best to record this video on my computer. It would be too hard to do a long video on my phone. I'm sorry, I was a little sick. But I figured I could still get my points across. So on to Ireland. The British did make mistakes in Ireland, but these mistakes ebbed and waned with the people who were in power in Britain. There were administrations in Britain that were objectively bad, but the vast majority of administrations in Ireland actually attempted to help the Irish people, are actually fair and light-handed, especially compared to the way other European countries acted at that same time period. Oh god, I get a cough again. Sorry, yes, still sick. For example, the Tudor dynasty, despite some calls from people and for nobles in England, sought to assimilate the Irish clans into the English aristocracy rather than wipe them out and wipe out that culture entirely. Other European powers at the time might not have done the same thing, and in fact, they often didn't. Moreover, people often mock the plantation system in Ireland, but what they don't realize is that many English people and governments, the rulers of England, when violence happened at plantations in Ireland, the plantations were often stopped. For example, Queen Elizabeth I was appalled by the violence at one of the plantations of Ireland and ordered it to be halted immediately, showing that she had sympathy for her Irish subjects and empathy for them as human beings. Okay, I need to get a drink. Okay, there we go. Hold on, I'm gonna pause this so I can get a drink. Okay, I'm back, and for the first few seconds, I want to play this song because it's an Irish version of the song. I think it puts here. And the Ulster, it is free. Irish nationality. Our ears, Irish the volunteers. Keep our British sovereignty. Okay, that's it. Okay, so back to Ireland. Well, back to talking about Ireland. So, the plantation system So not only did most British leaders, actually I think all of them, call on plantations to be stopped when when violence occurred. Plantations like Ulster, actually all the plantations, were set up in a way that the Irish did receive large tracts of land. For example, in Ulster, there was only 20,000 people living in an entire province when the British came and started the plantation system. Secondly, the British were there, but they started the plantation system. They started the plantation system when 20,000 people lived there. It was the poorest region of the poorest part of Europe. The people in Ireland in general at this time lived a lifestyle more similar to the Native Americans than other Europeans. It was the land of saints and scholars, but there wasn't much wealth to be found outside of monasteries. That was where all the wealth was had. Outside of that, people lived a pretty subsistent lifestyle in small villages that were pretty much where the people lived in pretty much huts. The British gave these 20,000 people a third of the land, meaning that each Irish person had 8 times the land that English or Scottish settler got. Which, if that's oppression, I want to be oppressed. I want to get 8 times the amount of land my rich neighbor receives. And not only that, but Ulster quickly became the richest part of Ireland because it resisted the plantation system the least. I also want to remind you that even if the plantation system is controversial because it brought settlers into an island that they didn't previously inhabit, first off, I don't see that it's controversial, but even if it is, I want to point out that the British did this because the attempts to assimilate the clans over centuries into the English aristocracy were only moderately successful because the Irish were just very difficult to rule. They were constantly rebelling, and they weren't rebelling out of a source of national movement or national anger. It was just their upper class rebelling against the British because they wanted power, which a lot of things in world history come down to power and wealth. Yes, someone once told me who's sleeping with who and who's getting rich off something is what typically dominates human history. And the Irish definitely want to have all the riches of Ireland, even if they were small. They want to have the power. So anyways, back to the plantation system. So yes, so Ulster quickly became the richest part of that island and one of the richest areas in Europe. It was the first part of Ireland to industrialize. Belfast, by the year 1900, had a larger population than Dublin, which, by the way, Dublin at this time was also industrializing. And while Dublin was very poor, so was London at this time, and London was especially poor when it first started industrializing. So to the British, this wasn't a big issue. This was just natural. And it really is natural. When a country industrializes, it starts off poor. There's a lot of poor people. And Ireland definitely would not have industrialized if it had not been for English control. Why? Because there's no coal in Ireland. There's very little valuable resources in Ireland. That's probably why the country remained poor. And the country was constantly fighting itself over itself before the British came. It was pretty much in a perpetual state of civil war after the High Kingdom collapsed in the 800s, and the title just became like a figurehead. It was like a Holy Roman Empire, except a lot more bloody. Now, also I want to point out that the Stuart dynasty was even more sympathetic to the Irish than the Tudors. So the Stuart dynasty often broke what was European precedent and normal at the time when dealing with Irish rebels, treating them with large amounts of leniency, not even throwing them in prison often, but just confiscating their titles, which was not heard of in Europe at the time. Typically, if you rebelled against your king and you were like of the nobility, or actually you were anyone, you got killed. You were executed. But the Stuarts often just were like, oh, you only get your titles removed. And then ironically, well, actually I shouldn't say ironically, foolishly, these same people would eventually then rebel again, and then they were just deported. Then you can argue that in a later part of the Stuart reign, the Stuarts were bad to Ireland because they were Protestant now, but that's not actually true. It was the Anglican Irish, the people who were Anglicans living in Ireland at the time, who not just wanted to oppress Catholics, but also Presbyterians. And they did this out of revenge because because in this century, often there was a lot of Jacobite rebellions by Presbyterians and Catholics in Ireland, and they wanted vengeance for that. They also wanted to stop that, and so they enforced the penal laws. And over the course of the 1700s, many people in actually England, not just Ireland, protested the penal laws, and British literature, which was a required course in American schools, most states require it. We read actually stories. Well, actually, it wasn't assigned to us, but it was in our textbook, and I read it regardless because I love to read and research and learn. Anyways, it was in our books, several stories about people in England at the time writing about the cruelty of the penal laws and that they should be ended. So not all British people were bad, and there was a lot of uproar in England about it. And it was not even the English people who were pushing it, it was the Anglicans in Ireland. Remember that the Kingdom of Ireland, while under the British Crown, had its own parliament and its own laws. It was not always beholden to the British Parliament. It could often do what it wanted to do, which was also meaning that it was largely independent till the Acts of Union. Another fun fact. Also, I want to point out as my last point in Ireland that until the Irish potato famine, most Irish people supported the continuation of the Union. Furthermore, although potato famine was a mistake, like I said, all governments make mistakes, and their government often did the best they could, and they took the moral high ground a lot of the time. But there are governments in British history that are bad, sort of like how an American presidency today, Donald Trump, has camps at the border where they put children. Does that mean that every American president is like that? Does that mean that America is a bad country? No, it does not mean that. America makes a lot of mistakes, but that doesn't mean that Americans are inherently evil. Does it mean that the American way of life is bad? The American values are inherently bad. There's nothing good about it. No, the British made a mistake in the potato famine because originally their previous government, which under the Tories was trying to help the Irish by setting up soup kitchens in the lot, and the successive government was really racist because the prime minister was really racist. He was a lot of curse words come into my mind, and he then changed policy that you had to work to get your food, and a lot of people couldn't, and he was just really bigoted. And that was a mistake, but the people elected him in Britain, and Ireland had a say in electing him. They set representatives, but they were a smaller population, so they had less. But anyways, he was still elected, and he was still a mistake. He made a mistake. He was a bad person. You should not judge an entire nation, an entire institution that lasted 800 years over one person. And even after the potato famine, the majority of the people in Ireland still supported remaining in the United Kingdom in some form. They supported Home Rule, in which Ireland would remain a part of the United Kingdom, would have its own national parliament. Not national, I just said like regional parliament. Sort of like how Hungary existed in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The people in the 1916 Eastern Rising were regarded as radicals, and when the British troops entered Dublin, at first they were greeted by the mass majority of the population in the outskirts chanting "God Save the King." Now that's all I got to say about Ireland. Now we're going to move on to India. Okay, never mind. Sorry, looking at my notes, we're actually moving on to... Oh yeah, we are moving on to India. I was right. So in India, when the British started conquering India and establishing the British Raj, or what was also called Indian Empire at the time, or just India, India had been an anarchy for at least 100 years, probably more. I just forget exactly how many. Definitely at least 100 years, I know that much. The Mughal Empire had pretty much stopped existing as a cohesive force, and India was like in a warring states period that China had. The states were often going to war with each other. It was violent, although many British people would describe it as barbaric. Indian people would protest this as racist. and that is slightly racist. I will say slightly because there were barbaric practices the Indians did from an objective standpoint. The Indians at this time practiced something called widowed burning. So when a husband died, the wife would be thrown onto flames so she could die with him. And the British outlawed this. So yes, there were some Indian practices that are objectively barbaric. And there were also Indian practices that were barbaric by moral standards in the West at the time. And they were barbaric, actually not even just in the West, around the world homosexuality was persecuted at this time for various reasons. It's a taboo in many cultures, even though it exists in all species. And while we are moving past that and we see that gay people are natural now, for the vast majority of human history this has not been the case, so that's another thing that was prevalent in Indian society at some level that the British stopped. And that's not to say, but let's not single out the British for doing that. Everyone else in the world, from Japan to China, also felt this way at that time. People in Japan and China felt this way, with Japan only legalizing homosexuality in 1880, and that was among the first in the modern world. And the United States didn't even legalize homosexuality in all states until 2003. So to say the British are terrible for this is misrepresenting historical facts. Furthermore, let's go back to the topic at hand. Sometimes I get off topic. I apologize for that. But so yes, when the British came to India, they brought unity and order to India. That's why the Indians like to call it the Raj, because they say that the British made India one kingdom. They made India one country because India was very fractured and violent at this time. The British put a stop to this. So not only did the British put a stop to this, like I said, they also put a stop to practices like widow burning, and they brought a fair and honest administration that they brought everywhere else. But also, an historical point I'd like to point out is that people in India and across the empire, except where local governments passed laws against this, when the local governments had more reign, like in Australia and South Africa that were dominions, everyone had a right, everyone who was a British subject in the colonies had a right to vote. India, there's a special case. But no matter where you were in the empire, you had a right to a fair trial, to be a trial decided by your equals. You did not receive a jury trial or a fair trial because you were black, because you were brown, because you were Muslim or Hindu, or because you were practicing African religion. No, everyone had the right to a fair trial. And the British court system in India was among the world's best at the time, rivaling even the West. And when the British left India, many Indian people noticed how the state of their administration and legal system decayed, and many actually wished for British rule to return, but it was too late. Now, that is something that is not often mentioned. Also, I'd like to point out that 60% of Jamaicans would want to return to colonial rule. I've actually met a Jamaican in my high school who told me he would want to return to colonial rule. This was found out after the Jamaican government wanted to scrap the Queen as Queen of Jamaica. And then when that sort of went to the wayside when that poll came out, wonder why. Anyways, furthermore, let's go back to India. Yeah, so the British actually did a lot of good in India. Now, another thing that people in India like to say is that there's a whole province in India where you can't grow crops because the British, besides opium, because the British planted opium there. People object to the fact that British planted opium at all, saying, oh, that's so terrible, they sold drugs to everyone in the world. Yeah, but the British also used drugs. The novel Frankenstein was written by a woman who, when she wrote the book, was high on opium the entire time she wrote it. I forget what her name was, but yes, I learned that in my British literature class as well. Most British writers at that time used opium when they were writing. That's not something I recommend, by the way. But apparently that makes you a really good writer, I guess. Makes you tell really crazy stories, like someone who's a reanimated corpse. And it wasn't just writers who used it, scientists used it, the upper class used it, aristocracy used it. It was a common drug around the world, and if the British used it too, they were like, why don't we sell this drug to other people? We use it, why can't others? And yes, that now leads me to the Opium Wars. So in the Opium Wars, Britain was selling opium to China because it's the only thing the Chinese would actually buy. The Chinese had something the British desperately needed. They had tea. If you're British, which my grandparents are, you drink tea all the time. The other day, I had 20 cups of tea. I really shouldn't have had done that because I take ADHD medicine. I still feel the effects of that tea right now. But also, I think I almost had a heart attack. But basically, we love tea. Cream and sugar and tea is the best thing on earth. From Yorkshire tea to any other kind of tea, you can never have too much tea. Okay, now let's get on with my tea obsession. um, uh, so yeah, the Chinese had tea and they had and that was the main reason why we sold opium because we needed their tea because we were addicted to the tea. We loved the tea, and they also had silk and other goods that we couldn't get in Britain. The Chinese wouldn't take our manufacturing goods. They wouldn't take any goods we had. We had to pay in gold and silver, which was rapidly depleted in the British treasury. And then we thought, hey, we're growing opium in India, and these Chinese people, 10 million of them are hooked on opium. Why don't we just supply them with the opium? So we supplied them with the opium, and we had the Opium War. And then we got Hong Kong. You could say it was wrong to sell the Chinese opium, but if we were smoking it too, what's really the moral problem there? I mean, in our perspective, we're just selling them a drug we ourselves use. Now, moving on from that, in Hong Kong's case, we developed a solid city in Hong Kong. Only a few dozen people lived in Hong Kong when the British came in the 1830s. Now, millions of people live there. It is the richest city in China. It's one of the richest cities per capita in the world. Most faster businesses that have headquarters in China are headquartered in Hong Kong. And Hong Kong actually did not want to return to China. They liked being in British rule because under British rule, you at least had equality before the law. Like I said, you had jury trials. You had an inalienable right to free speech, free press, freedom of religion, which was the right of every British subject, even if you couldn't vote directly for your governor in Hong Kong, or even if you didn't really have a legislator yet, you still had inalienable rights that are not seen in China. And you're all still richer than everyone else in China. China wanted Hong Kong because it would really improve their economy. It's the jewel of China, just as the Raj was the jewel in the British crown. Now, the British also founded the city-state of Singapore. Singapore was not a city before the British founded it, and within a few decades, it was one of the largest trading hubs in the world because of its position in the world. You know, it's at a perfect place for trade. Lots of ships will pass through there. And while I will admit that at the time, the British administration in that case was one of the rare cases where British didn't bring British administration because they didn't think of Singapore as that valuable. They ran it from British India and it was pretty poorly managed, but they eventually reformed that and Singapore became a pretty great place. It's now one of the richest cities in Asia, and while they did make mistakes in Singapore, they didn't have Hong Kong, they didn't have Singapore. These two great centers of global finance and business would not exist today. These states are democratic-ish. Well, Singapore is a democracy, and Hong Kong is more democratic than China. These beacons of, let's just say these beacons of global trade and business would not exist. And it's the British we have to thank for that. Now I'm going to move on to Australia and New Zealand. So Australia is a really controversial topic in British history. I'm not going to mince words. What Australia did to the Aboriginals, in my opinion, actually does constitute genocide. And I'm glad the Australian government has since apologized for that. That is also, like I said, one of the exceptions to British rule and not the rule. I think I wanted to mention this, but I forgot to mention this. In British India, there was an officer who killed 1,000 Indian civilians because someone raped an English woman and he sort of wanted to make an example of them. And then King Edward VII himself dismissed this officer, threw him in prison, and told him this is not the British way of doing business. So yes, a lot of people who committed crimes in empire did face repercussions. While you will then point out that this person was later released because public pressure was so great because of the newspapers were publishing him as a hero, I want to point out that the British government, at least in this case, from the king himself, did the right thing. And in Australia, it was a white settler colony first off, so it had more rights than other colonies had the right to self-government because these people came from Britain. Of course, British people want to give these people self-government. They're their own people, and they will carry the weight of the empire because they have faith in Britain because they are British. They'll fight for Britain because they're British. If you give people in Africa self-government, there's no guarantee they'll fight for Britain. They don't have British culture, at least not yet. And we actually didn't want to force British culture, just some fundamental human values. So in Africa, we could not give people the same level of self-government because it was not guaranteed of self-government if they would honor their obligation to Britain. In Australia, it was pretty clear. And on New Zealand, it was pretty clear. In Canada, it was pretty clear they would. These people are British. They fought for Britain. They're from Britain. Their grandparents might have been from Britain, and in some cases, these people were even born in Britain, as far recent as Gallipoli. These people, we can trust them. We can give them self-government, rather than face the threat that we could lose them entirely, because again, they're British. Now, Australia, like I just said, they had self-government, so they could sort of do their own thing. Now, the Australians, what they decided to do is they decided that they would hunt Aboriginals because they said the Aboriginals were a threat to them. So in the frontier wars, they killed 20,000 Aboriginals, and a lot of Aboriginals died from disease. Now, the British did not purposely cause this disease, and in fact, once the smallpox disease, they actually in the 1840s had a smallpox eradication campaign where they vaccinated the vast majority of Aboriginals they could find against smallpox. They did not want to commit genocide to the extent the Spanish did, accidentally. But the Australians still didn't give the Aboriginals the right to vote. They still did have hunting parties against them earlier than this, because they feared them because there were in the days of the initial colony, the Aboriginals often attacked the settlers, but it didn't stop there. Like, the Aboriginals didn't have the right to vote. They enforced segregation, and then Aboriginals were taken from their homes as children to be raised by white parents, or they were raised to be laborers or servants, which is really messed up. And then there was also some sort of slavery system going on there until the 70s. Even after the Aboriginals were given the right to vote the same year, the U.S. officially, well, not officially, in all technicality, gave black people the right to vote in the South. The same year the Aboriginals were given the right to vote. So I want to point that out, that they did the same, that the Australia was no far behind in many cases than the U.S., which you all argue, which not many people would argue is degraded on morals, at least to the extent that they do the British Empire. But now I also want to point out that Australia eventually did apologize for all this, and they actually didn't just apologize. Now Aboriginals are protected by the Australian government, and the Australian government has a national day of remembrance. Okay, I'm gonna pause again. Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that. But yeah, Australia has a national day of remembrance for what they did to the Aboriginals, and they made a form of apology. And I honestly think if they do some more reparations and more trying to outreach, they could really make up for what they did. And that's what we should be doing. We should recognize that the British Empire was overall a force for good, but it made mistakes. I also want to point out that in New Zealand, this was not the case. This was another British dominion, and New Zealand, from the very start of the colony, signed a treaty with the Maori, the native people of New Zealand, saying that they would share the colony together and they would be equals. And the New Zealanders, or Kiwis, as the nickname is, their unofficial nickname, they, for the large part of their history, treated their native people better than any other Western power or any other colonial power in history treated the native people. When the New Zealanders, the white New Zealanders, took land from the Maori, they were always fully compensated the Maori, and the Maori had a larger portion of land than any other native people and everywhere else in the world that was colonized at the turn of the century, and things only got better from there. Yeah, like, I don't know if, yes, New Zealand is that part of Australia because New Zealand didn't want the Australians to treat the Maori like the Aboriginals were being treated. And Maori eventually Maori eventually are now to the point today where there's really little discrimination against them. There wasn't much to start out with, but now Maoris and New Zealanders live together, work together, and Maori culture is celebrated by even white New Zealanders. So, while the British made mistakes in Australia, large ones, and next to New Zealand, they did the exact opposite and were among the most progressive in the world in their treatment of the native people there. And there are even Maori political parties in New Zealand now, and there have been for many decades, that are for Maoris, and they promote Maori rights. And they don't actually, they're not necessarily promoting Maori rights, they're just promoting the interest of the Maori community. Because Maoris have always really had rights. And in Australia and New Zealand, even in Australia, these two countries were the first countries in the entire world to give women the right to vote. So Australia did some fucked up things to its natives. They still were, with New Zealand, the first country to give women the right to vote in the 1890s. The United States wouldn't give women the right to vote until 1920. And Great Britain wouldn't give women the right to vote until 1917, 27 and 30 years later, around about, because I think it was New Zealand that gave women the right to vote in 1893, and Australia was followed by in 1894, if I'm not mistaken. I do know it's the 1890s, but I'm not sure if those are the exact years. It's been a long time since I've actually read that fact. I was in 8th grade the last time I learned about that. I was 14. In my world history textbook I was reading for fun at the time. Now, the last thing I want to say is my closing statement. Yes, the British Empire did do bad things. We did bad things in Kenya at one point. We did do some bad things in various parts of the world, but by and large, we did more than any other people to promote the ideas of limited government, inalienable human rights, Judeo-Christian Islamic values, free markets, than any other power. We brought wealth to far reaches of the earth, and we defended our values of inalienable human rights and free markets against the tyrannies of first fascism and then communism. Of course, with fascism, we had our empire backing us, and our empire was reigning in our fight against communism, but still, we remain committed to these values for our empire's continued existence. British Empire is not something we should be ashamed of. It's something we should cherish. We should recognize it did bad things. We should apologize for them. And not just apologize, we should maybe have a National Day of Remembrance where we remember that those things did happen. But we should also recognize and have a National Day celebrating the great things the Empire did, because overall the Empire was a force for good, genuine good in the world. Americans like to say that their country is at its best when it promotes its core values of accepting everyone from around the world. Britain should say our empire was at its best when it accepted its mission statement of bringing inalienable human rights and good administration to the far reaches of the earth, and bringing free markets. It was at its worst when it committed crimes, which those crimes were few and far between. Okay, of course there are exceptions like Australia, where that happened often, but still the Australians, like I just mentioned, did a lot of good things. We should also make reparations to the ethnic groups that were affected. And if the local governments don't want to make reparations in the cases of Australia, the British government, despite any political repercussions, should in fact make reparations on their own, on behalf of the Crown, to the people, the Aboriginals. We should be proud to be British. We should be proud of the Empire. We should be proud of all that's accomplished. I'm a son of the Empire. My great My great-grandparents were born in Northern Ireland. I have my grandfather's mother was from England, well, ancestrally, and I also have Scottish in me. And while it's been a few generations since I've been British, I still actually have British birthright through my grandmother, because if she claims it through her parents and grandparents, then I can myself claim it, and I plan on doing that. I'm actually going to Britain for the first time this October, where I'll be visiting Northern Ireland first and then England. And Britain has had a very special place in my heart since the time I was only 7 years old. I know I'm proud to be British and Austrian, as you can see here, and as you probably see from my political post in Austria. But Britain was always first in my heart. It was the first country I loved. Now I love Britain and Austria equally, but by being first in my heart, it's the first place I really truly loved. I love my heritage, and I plan on actually being a British subject and Austrian citizen someday, even though that's extremely hard to do. I'll make it work. Because those are my countries, those are where I feel I belong. I'm a child of British colonialism, I'm a child of Britain, and I'm proud. We should all be proud. Like I said, we spread free markets and then have human rights around the world, and we have an opportunity now to continue to do that through CASNAC. Now, there's an organization, I think it's called CASNAC International. I'm sorry, I'm a new member to there. I actually pay $16 a month to help support them. They promote a free trade area between Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom, the four dominions of the British Empire and Britain herself, well, besides Newfoundland and South Africa, but you know, get the point. And we also support free movement, like the EU has between them, and we support a unified policy on human rights and education. And I hope someday we support a unified policy on trade, and we form a single trade group, because combined our economies are $6 trillion US, making us which will make us the third largest economic area in the world if we were a single economy, larger than even Japan or Germany. We would have considerable weight in the world again, and it's honestly the right thing to do. I mean, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Britain have cultural links that make us the most culturally homogeneous places in the world. People in Canada and Australia and New Zealand and Britain have more in common than any other two countries in the world, maybe except Canada and the United States and Germany and Austria. We're all English speaking. We all share a common history through the empire and through the success of the Commonwealth. We all share a common head of state, common Westminster system of government. We have a lot in common. We have similar cultures. We speak the same language. We should have free movement. It's the right thing to do, and it will allow us to continue to influence the world affairs much better than we do right now, and to continue to be a beacon of Western light civilization, of which we always strive to be, and we often were when we were at our best. Not actually when we were at our best, we were often at our best. There was very few times when we did not live up to those values. Rule Britannia, God save the Queen, and good night.